Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Atlantic Council. My name is Javed Ahmed. I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. We all saw how the United States ended its war in Afghanistan after a frustrating 20-year cycle. The war effectively ended in full circle where it started, with the Taliban in charge. It's been almost 6 months since the Taliban are in power. In these past 6 months, have been frustratingly challenging, mainly for millions of the Afghan people as they endure a crippling humanitarian tragedy, a bad winter and a paralyzing drought, mass starvation, large-scale unemployment, and more in continuing uncertainty about their future. The Taliban's new ruling class, which involves their uneasy and governing coalition, with the Haqqani network, they have remained largely stubborn and uncompromising. They've so far ruled on their own terms. They've resisted political compromise to form an inclusive government. They have trampled basic representative values, including banishing women from schools and public. They've also cracked down on dissent. They've engaged in arbitrary detentions and extrajudicial killings without accountability. And all this while they have weathered domestic and external pressures. The Taliban's exclusionary path have caused widespread public and international opposition, and this has created an existential crisis of coexistence between the Taliban and non-Taliban Afghans. All while the Taliban's new rulers have pushed for a diplomatic recognition of their new exclusive Taliban-only government, and they have demanded the release of billions of dollars in frozen Afghan state assets, which they have effectively claimed or continued to claim as war spoils, all while they've resisted to accept basic conditions set forth by Western powers in some regional countries. At the same time, nearly all neighboring countries and those in the broader region have engaged with the Taliban without recognizing them. Most of these countries have begun to realign their own approaches to meaningfully deal with the Taliban. There's also a growing basket of militant and jihadist groups who appears to be in a wait-and-see mode and are patiently reorganizing their own forces. It's not unlikely that some of them will go into establishing a consortium of tactical partnerships and tactical alliances, especially if most or some of them no longer feel comfortable under the umbrella of the Taliban's patronage. Now, having said all that, what outcomes can be expected in the months ahead? Are the Taliban capable of governing through a compromise? What does diplomatic recognition mean for the Taliban? How is it viewed by the international community? How might the ecosystem of terrorism going forward and the ecosystem of jihadism in the region transform? And what might the Taliban contribute to this shifting terror threat? And what are the likely implications for the broader region, as well as the United States, as they develop their own approaches to engage with the new regime? Now, to discuss these and other questions, we have with us today a stellar panel of long-time Afghanistan and South Asia watchers. Let me briefly introduce them before we begin our discussion. Joining us today is Ambassador Jim Cunningham, who's my colleague here at the Atlantic Council, is a senior non-resident fellow, and he was formerly U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. Also joining us is Lisa Curtis, who is currently a senior fellow and a director of Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for Neo-American Security, and she previously served as a senior director for South and Central Asia on the national security staff in the White House. Also joining us is Dr. Bruce Hoffman, who's a longtime counterterrorism scholar, and among his many hats, he's currently professor at Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, as well as a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And finally, joining us is Carlotta Gall from the New York Times, a familiar face who has covered Afghanistan and Pakistan for over a decade. And is currently the Turkey bureau chief for the New York Times. But thank you all for joining us, and let me welcome our viewers as well, and thank them for tuning in to our discussion today. What we will do today is that for the first 45 to 50 minutes, I'll engage our speakers in a moderated discussion, and I will then take some questions from the audience. Now, to our audience, you could leave your questions to our speakers in the chat box. Also, you can also follow this conversation on Twitter with the tag @Atlantic Council and AC or @AC South Asia using hashtag Afghanistan. So Ambassador Cunningham, let me start off with you, like with the first question. The Taliban's regime is almost 6 months old. In your view, how are they doing? Can you give us and our viewers a quick overview of the state of affairs in Afghanistan, particularly in Taliban's Afghanistan? Where do things stand?
Well, I think by any normal measure, one would have to say that they're doing very poorly. But my understanding is they have a different definition of, or a different idea about what performance means in terms of government. They don't have any real ability to govern. Some of the ministries, I understand, are functioning because they have kept on at least some of the career civil servants, but many of them are not. The economy is in a shambles, of course, as is the financial system. So there's no sign that I can see of, or among the people that I've been speaking to, that the Taliban have any inclination to change or to adapt to that situation. Rather, they are focused on a certain set of goals, establishing control, which they've been pretty good at, it seems, quashing the media, fending off pressures for inclusive governance and human and women's rights. And they've been focusing on a series of steps to gain international recognition and legitimacy, which they do want, but which they're not willing to pay a price for, it seems. In getting to meetings where they can propagandize, such as the Oslo meeting, and in holding the Afghan people hostage to force the international community to provide aid and assistance to Afghanistan on their terms. And so it's not a very pretty picture, I'm afraid, but it's certainly not unexpected.
You're absolutely right, Ambassador Cunningham. Lisa, let me turn to you. Ambassador Cunningham gave us a good lay of the land. And you just authored a great report for CNAS on dealing with the Taliban. So I guess my question for you would be that, I mean, there have been many predictions in recent years about what might happen were the Taliban to take over the country. And now that they have, how does this new reality of a Taliban rule Afghanistan compare? And what, if anything, has surprised you in the last 6 months?
Great. Thank you, Javed and the Atlantic Council, for inviting me here today. And it's a real honor to be with the other distinguished panelists. I think that what we're seeing play out so far is largely expected. I think the restrictions they have put on women and girls is what we expected. We're hearing that girls are not able to go to secondary school in most provinces. Of course, today, or just this week, they announced universities were opening for both men and women, but there's still strict rules of segregation. And so we have yet to see how access to education for women will really play out, even though it is at least a small positive step that women are being allowed to return to classes. But the reason the Taliban say that girls have not been allowed to go to secondary school is because they need to work out transportation, because girls are not allowed to move around on their own. And this, of course, is a major human rights violation of the women, not allowing them to be able to have freedom of movement. And of course, we've seen the reports of the detentions of women's activists, very worrisome. We even saw one woman show up dead after having led a protest in Afghanistan. So I think it's not surprising to see that they have implemented the same kinds of restrictions on women and girls that they did during their previous time in power. Now, it's a positive thing that the Biden administration has appointed Rina Amiri as the special envoy for women and girls and human rights. She'll be able to use her platform to raise women's issues. She's already doing so. Just today, she tweeted about the Taliban detaining 2 female activists. So, this is a way for the United States to push back and to raise concerns about these issues. But I think what has surprised me most is how powerful the hardliners, the Haqqani network, is in the current setup. This surprised me. The fact that Sirajuddin Haqqani was named Interior Minister, the fact that you have several Haqqani leaders in positions of power. Hassan Akhund is the prime minister, and you see people like Baradar and Salam Hanafi sort of relegated to deputy level positions. I think this is surprising. We knew that Pakistan would have influence, but the sort of ascendancy of the Haqqani network within the governing system shows that Pakistan really is very influential. So I think that is a very troubling aspect of the situation. I think it really sends a bad signal in terms of future terrorism trends. We know the Haqqanis have a close relationship with Al-Qaeda. So I think that the stage is set really for a reemergence of the same kind of terrorist safe haven that we saw in the 1990s. So I think, the situation is concerning. I think that the international community is right to continue engaging, not to recognize, but to try to use aid and assistance to influence the Taliban's policies toward the Afghans they're supposedly governing. And so I think this is the right approach, not to recognize, to keep the sanctions in place, but yet try to influence and shape Taliban behavior moving forward.
Lisa, just let me push back on that one. Ambassador Cunningham alluded to this as well, that the economy is in shambles. Financially, they're not doing well. There's a liquidity crisis. There's a humanitarian crisis, all while they have asked for a diplomatic recognition. They've asked for the frozen Afghan assets to be released as well. So in essence, they have, as Ambassador Cunningham alluded to, they've taken the Afghan people hostage. So in this case, whoever intervenes, including the United States, the Taliban perceive it as an interference in their internal affairs, not just in their internal affairs, but in Afghanistan's internal affairs. So how do you strike a balance in where you could meaningfully engage with the Taliban, but also for them not to see this as an interference?
Yeah, well, let me be clear. I think there are ways to get aid and assistance to the Afghan people without going through the Taliban, without legitimizing the Taliban or providing them recognition. And, we see the World Bank is starting to provide salaries to civil servants. I think this is a good thing. We need to get cash in the system. The Afghan people cannot just be left to suffer. So we have to find creative ways to help the Afghan people without going through the Taliban. Releasing the frozen assets, the $7 billion that the U.S. holds and the additional $2 to $3 billion that Europe holds, certainly that should not be released to the Taliban. But maybe there are ways to get that directly to humanitarian organizations, or to use it to pay countries that are providing services. The Uzbeks, Tajiks provide electricity to Afghanistan. So maybe the frozen assets are used to pay these countries that are providing services to Afghanistan. So again, you're bypassing the Taliban. You're not allowing money to go in the hands of terrorists, but you're still finding ways to help the Afghan people. I really think that is the way forward. As I said, sanctions should stay on the Taliban and Haqqani leaders. 2/3 of the cabinet have either US or UN sanctions on them. Those should certainly stay in place until we see clear evidence and action on both human rights and counterterrorism issues.
And I do want to come back to finding these creative ways to economically engage with Afghanistan and engage in a way where it does not directly benefit the Taliban or the regime elements, including the Haqqanis, even though there will always be a certain threshold for certain leakages to the Taliban, mainly because they are the de facto authority. So, but I'm going to come back to that one. But I want to turn to Bruce and ask him perhaps if you could build on what Lisa said about the Taliban and their absolute rule. I mean, how is this new regime governing, and who exactly is governing within the Taliban? I mean, it appears like there is this internal compact between the Taliban's ideologues, their clerics, their pragmatists, their hardliners, and their businessmen. How exactly are they managing this internal compact among themselves, and how are they maintaining this internal rank cohesion and discipline among themselves, and who are they accountable to at the end of the day?
Well, let me also join the other speakers in saying how honored and delighted I am to have been asked to participate in this discussion, and that's an excellent question. The present and perhaps the future doesn't look like the past did, at least so far as the exact dimensions of the Taliban's relationship with Al-Qaeda. I think they're both completely on the same page, and we always knew this. And I've spoken to people who were involved in negotiations in Doha, and they said that the Taliban delegation was completely upfront about their ongoing close relations with the Taliban, with Al-Qaeda, and that Al-Qaeda was always whispering in their ear. We know that Al-Qaeda was actually pivotal in many of the successes that the Taliban had, going from more recently the suppression of dissident forces in Panjshir to an actual Al-Qaeda presence in 8 different provinces in the lead up to the reconquest. What I think is different from before is that they're both playing the long game. And one could argue that it was playing precisely this long game of patience and persistence that enabled the Taliban to reconquer Afghanistan. For instance, we don't see, and I didn't expect to see, Al-Qaeda run training camps or training bases maintained outwardly or promiscuously by, let's say, Al-Qaeda's Central Asian allies. It's all much quieter. Many of these units are being either integrated into existing Taliban forces. So unlike the Brigade 055 model of 20 plus years ago, they're more quietly integrated. I think the Taliban want to make sure that they exercise control over the foreign fighters in the country for exactly the reasons we're discussing. They want to put the best possible face on their rule for the West and hopefully get those funds released. But I think there's another critical element to, let's say, the oversight the Taliban is exercising today in contrast to 2 or 3 decades ago, is that they're desperately afraid of defections, whether it's in the Taliban ranks or Al-Qaeda or any of the Central Asian jihadi groups, defections to ISIS-K. So it's rather more controlled than it's been in the past. But that's not to say that it's moderated. I think, at least in Al-Qaeda's case, everything that they've wanted, they've gotten from the Taliban's victory. They've restored the Taliban to rule, which was always their goal, and they always pledged fealty to whoever the Taliban's mullah or leader was. They've reacquired a sanctuary in a safe haven with absolutely no conditions and no restrictions. And they both believe that they have beaten the West and the United States in particular in this contest of wills. They see this victory as a product not just of their patience, but of divine ordination. Of course, in October 2004, bin Laden predicted this. He said, and no one listened to him at the time, but he said, just as the power of the Mujahideen, supported by Al-Qaeda, defeated the Red Army and precipitated not just its withdrawal, but the collapse of the Soviet Union and demise of communism. He said that through this indirect strategy and with time and patience, they would do the same in the United States. And if one, at least in my perspective, from having studied terrorism for more than 4 decades now, if there's one Achilles heel historically in all terrorist organizations, is that it's this hubris or overconfidence, and they always overplay their hand. And I have no doubt that Al-Qaeda, with the support of the Taliban, whether active or tacit, will come to feel so comfortable in this new, very cozy arrangement in Afghanistan that they'll once again start to, there was already an aborted plot this July in Lucknow where AQIS was planning a significant terrorist attack. I would say that was kind of a dry run. We're going to see more of that in the, maybe not the months to come, but the years to come for sure.
Well, those are all excellent points, Bruce. I'm going to come back to the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban question later when we discuss the region as well. But you're absolutely right. There are defections, or at least there are fears and risks of defections. And I think the more Taliban ranks or elements within the Taliban across the board defect to groups like ISIS-K, I think the more it's going to bring the Taliban closer to Al-Qaeda as well. And I think that relationship, while it has been quite symbiotic over the past 2 or 3 decades, it will become much more strengthened because and Al-Qaeda, feels pretty comfortable under their patronage, and they will continue to feel much more comfortable. And I think beyond this, as you mentioned, on South Asia side, there is this romanticization of the Taliban's victory among the South Asia-based jihadists, AQIS and others included, others in Kashmir. And I think we have seen how, after Al-Qaeda praised the Taliban's victory and they, glorified them, and they continue to glorify them, with foreign jihadis, including those in the broader Central Asia region, also South Asia region, using Taliban monikers like Al-Emirati and Al-Afghan and Al-Mansuri, just so they could glorify them. And it's very interesting how they've actually embraced the Taliban as a victory template. And most of them are using their frequent flight miles to travel to Afghanistan. There are thousands of them that have since poured into Afghanistan. But I do want to come back to that one a bit later. Carlotta, you've been a long time observer of Afghanistan and, of course, the region, and you have seen how the Taliban are unapologetically cracking down on dissent. We've seen journalists, including women, who are getting pulled out of their homes and are getting disappeared, and that is pretty, un-Afghan, to like to say it at the least. But when you ask the Taliban about them, they deny knowledge of their whereabouts publicly. But we've also seen at the same time that revenge killings have increased. There are ethnic tensions that have grown. There's a civil society that have gone largely viral or is non-existent. And so the list of issues and demands from the non-Taliban Afghans, it hasn't really changed. So what is happening in your view on the ground and elsewhere? And are the Taliban capable of finding a point of compromise with the non-Taliban Afghans? And if not, can the non-Taliban Afghans accommodate with the Taliban's model?
Very good question. Delighted to be with you. I think the Taliban, at least my experience of the Taliban, and I don't think they've changed from over the 20 years that I've been following them, or longer, in fact. They will crush dissent. They believe in ruling by power, by strength. I'll always remember a Taliban commander who I interviewed back in sort of around 2014. He said, we just have to kill 2 people in a village and the village is ours. So I think it's really how they know. So they know by force. So I think they're being extremely tough with the women, and not because it reflects at all on their morality towards the fairer sex, as they always call them, that they want to make an example and they want to stamp out any dissent as fast as possible. I think the same way that they are disappearing and executing a lot of the former Afghan army and intelligence people, as far as I understand from my reporting, it's far bigger than the 100 that the UN has confirmed has happened. It's much more serious. And it's happening all over the country. And they're doing that because they're terrified that they will go and join a resistance. And in the east of the country, I'm hearing that some of them are running away to join ISK, ISIS Khorasan, because those are the one people who can protect people, anti-Taliban people, from the Taliban. So they have a real problem, I think, actually, in the present and over months to come, of consolidating their power, because I think there is going to be resistance. There's going to be people running away, but also people who get extremely angry. And I think in the north that could happen as well quicker because of the whole north-south divide, the whole Pashtun ethnic minority divide. So I think the Taliban actually are going to have problems. In some places, they're quite wise, negotiating and so on. But I think they've even got internal divisions. So we've seen, of course, this division between the Haqqani people who came into Kabul and the Kandaharis, and we all know are very upset that they're not got total control as they expected. And that's a very dangerous divide as well. And I don't think the Taliban have sorted that out at all. In fact, I think it'll probably get worse, because their reaction will be, and it seems what the Haqqanis are doing, is seize more power for themselves instead of decentralizing and sharing power. And so I think we'll see some instability there going forward. I'm going to stop there because there's so much to say.
Absolutely. I think these upstream leadership tensions between the Haqqani leaders and the much larger Southern Taliban factions is really something. I mean, I often describe or characterize this as two scorpions in a bottle. That's very territorial, highly lethal, and deadly. And I think that's how it will become. And that's precisely why I asked the earlier questions about how exactly are they maintaining this compact among themselves. And I think it's really interesting, mainly because, and I think this is one of our greater disadvantage, as we engage or try to engage meaningfully with the new regime to see how they fare. It's our weakness mainly because we have zero insights into their ranks. So the entire Taliban governance model has been, or at least the face of it has been limited to what the Taliban spokesperson or two or three spokesperson basically says. So whatever they say, you have to believe it for what it is. But I want to, when I come to the regional questions, I do want to, build on that one. But I'll come back to Ambassador Cunningham about the humanitarian crisis, which is, is an existential crisis, and it hasn't, unfortunately, it has only worsened. I believe you were one of the signatories on the Atlantic Council online letter that we posted calling for an urgent humanitarian engagement. Now, there are various estimates, that shows that there are millions and millions of Afghans, perhaps even more than half the Afghan population, they face acute food shortages. And they're also food insecure. So is the provision of humanitarian assistance enough to address these crises, that looms large? And if so, for how long? And if not, what are some of the other, creative ways to, economically engage with them? And I also want to ask you about this frozen $9.5 billion in Afghan state reserves. I see that there are international banks that have started to transfer money to Afghanistan for humanitarian purposes. But what is this right balance for Washington to strike, given the severity of the economic / humanitarian situation, but also the scale of the need? Should the U.S. unfreeze this money? And if so, who would provide the oversight?
Well, it's It's one of the many very serious dilemmas that we now face in Afghanistan after the collapse of the Islamic Republic. To take your last question first, I personally do not believe that we should unfreeze the assets. There are also legal issues that surround what happens to those funds eventually. But just as a matter of policy, I don't believe that they should be unfrozen and returned to the Central Afghan Bank, which is what the Taliban want. Even with a system of rigorous controls, there's no way to isolate the Taliban from money that's going into the country. They will find ways to siphon some of it off, even from the humanitarian assistance that's going in through the UN and other agencies. But that effort does have to be undertaken. We have a moral and we collectively, the international community, but especially Americans, have a moral and practical duty to try to secure as much aid and assistance to the Afghan people as we can now and in the coming months. So I wholeheartedly support that. And yes, I signed that letter and also participated in other public articles and pieces urging a rapid international effort to organize the international community to provide that assistance. As we look at the future, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, apart from all the other difficulties that we have in dealing with this new dispensation, this new regime, which must not be recognized until a number of stringent conditions are met. But we need to remember that the Taliban and the Haqqanis are criminal enterprises. They have been living off the drug trade, extortion, illicit mining and smuggling for quite a long time, and they've made a lot of money at it. And there's no reason to think that they won't be doing the same, or individuals won't be doing the same when they have access to funding, which is another reason for trying to keep as much money, international money, as we can out of their hands. But so that's the dilemma, though. At the same time, Afghanistan does need a functioning financial system and banking system. And there needs to be money in the country to pay teachers and health workers and civil servants and to provide food and all that other stuff. So a lot of smart people have been trying to figure out the best way to go about doing this over the past couple weeks and months. The money is starting to move now. It has been for some time. And it's an effort that we need to see through, forming a coalition of international partners and with the UN and the World Bank and others to do this as efficiently as possible while safeguarding the funding as best we can going forward. What happens after this winter is, I think, a matter of very serious concern that not much attention is being paid to at the moment. But we need to get the Afghan people through the winter at least.
But then how practical is it in the medium to long term to provide such indirect financial assistance to Afghans through UN and other agencies without engaging with the Taliban directly? How practical is it in terms of not creating these parallel economic structures where it will again create these layers and layers of dependencies, very similar to what we did with the previous Afghan Republic enterprise?
Well, first of all, engaging with the Taliban is a practical necessity. That doesn't mean recognizing or legitimizing them. But the reality is they control the country, so there has to be some degree of engagement in order to move assets around and to keep the health system operating and things like that. But unfortunately, I don't see any real alternative at the moment to maintaining some kind of separation between the assistance effort, if you will, and the Taliban themselves. Now, mindful of the fact that the Taliban, as I said before, are not don't show any real sign of interest in doing a good job of governing. They seem to think that that's somebody else's responsibility or something that Allah will take care of. But to the extent we can, we need to find the right balance in this dilemma that I discussed earlier between keeping the Taliban at arm's length until they start performing in ways that the international community expects, and including most of the countries of the region expect, and in providing some degree of rescue for the Afghan people who, as I said earlier, are being held hostage by the Taliban.
Yeah. Let me bring in Bruce on this one. Bruce, you made very interesting comments earlier. You referred to the militants, jihadist scene, not just in Afghanistan, but also in the broader region. Now, where do the militants stand, for example, in this equation, the Pakistani one, the Afghan one, the Central Asian groups? Now, how have these groups benefited from not just the Taliban's takeover, but from romanticizing their victory? So how likely are the dangers of some kind of a militant reorganization and perhaps some kind of a reorientation to other theaters outside Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, certainly the applauding of the Taliban's victory wasn't confined to South Asia only. I mean, literally throughout the world. I mean, in Mali, in the Sahel, in Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, a variety of groups, Shia as well as Sunni, applauded the Taliban's victory and all claim they would emulate precisely the Taliban's patience and persistence. Indeed, I mean, Bakia is the term that has been used over the years. There's even a nasheed about it among ISIS, that if we just persist long enough or remain long enough, we'll eventually be successful. I think an indication of how a variety of regional forces could dangerously coalesce. We saw in the Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, the January edition of its online magazine, where it very quickly, I mean, really within days of the hostage taking in Colleyville, Texas, had an entire issue that celebrated the hostage taker, and indeed precisely an issue that is capable of uniting disparate groups, the fate of Afia Siddiqui. So, it's hard to predict these things because we're dealing with, in many cases, even in the Al-Qaeda universe of franchises that have very specific localized interests whose overall outlook conforms to Al-Qaeda's policy, but don't necessarily follow Al-Qaeda's orders. And I would say it's the same with ISIS and with their own network. But certainly there are any number of issues, starting from the Taliban's success, starting from the gleeful position that Al-Qaeda finds itself in, that we could see all sorts of permutations in the future. And that would certainly present destabilizing challenges.
Lisa, Carlotta, do you want to comment on what this, shifting threat mean for Pakistan's internal security? I mean, we're seeing an increase in militant attacks in Pakistan. Just this week, for example, we saw 7 Pakistani soldiers who were killed in separate attacks on military bases in Balochistan, for which I think the Balochistan Liberation Army took responsibility. There was a similar attack in Lahore a few days ago. The Pakistani military, of course, engaged right after the Taliban's takeover with the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, but that agreement, when it was reached, it was also short-lived. So how will, other networks like Lashkar-e-Taiba, for example, or Jaish-e-Mohammed, or TTP for that matter, now involved? Now, how does the Taliban takeover affect their capabilities and priorities? Are we looking at new tactical partnerships here?
Well, I think clearly the Taliban victory empowers Islamist extremists of all stripes. So that's all of the above: TTP, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed. But what matters for Pakistan, of course, LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed are tools of Pakistan's ISI. Used to undermine India, and have conducted, deadly attacks not only in Kashmir but in other parts of India as well, that have precipitated several Indo-Pakistani military crises over the years. So that's a big concern. TTP, yes, that's the problem for Pakistan, is that you can't allow Islamist extremist movement to take over the country next door and not expect it to have backlash in your own country. And so groups that fight the Pakistani state, like TTP, will also be emboldened. And so it's not surprising if we see increased attacks in Pakistan. But what I hope that doesn't do is lead people in the US government to believe they have to start, supporting Pakistan or seeing Pakistan as a counterterrorism partner, because they certainly are not. Pakistan has inimical interests to the United States in Afghanistan, now so more than ever. The fact that, the Taliban is now in power, Pakistan's not going to, try to moderate their behavior now. So I think, we're in a situation where we will continue to rely on Pakistani airspace for any kind of drone operations that we might have to carry out. Because the drone assets are in the Middle East, there's simply no other way to access Afghanistan except for Pakistani airspace. But beyond that, I don't think we should view Pakistan as a partner, as a counterterrorism partner in the region. They simply have different interests. They see the situation in Afghanistan very narrowly. They want to support those elements they can trust to keep India out. And those happen to be the Haqqani network. And as I said before, the Haqqani network is closely associated with Al-Qaeda. They are a designated, foreign terrorist organization under U.S. law. And so, I don't see that there are many opportunities for the U.S. to work with Pakistan in Afghanistan. We simply have varying goals there. And let me just add that in terms of the refugees that are spilling over into Iran and Pakistan, Pakistan has a moral responsibility to accept those refugees. It's largely responsible for the return of the Taliban to power. Taliban would have never been able to come back to power, especially as quickly as they did, without having a sanctuary in Pakistan and support from the Pakistani military over the last 20 years. So, Pakistan bears blame for the situation we now face in Afghanistan. And so they have a responsibility to help provide humanitarian assistance and to accept refugees that are coming into their country.
And then the refugee is also a convenient tool to be used as a political weapon, which was used not just by Pakistan, by other regional countries as well. But Carlotta, I want to come to you. Do you want to comment on this question? And perhaps, if I may add one additional question, perhaps on the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, the political militant party. Are we seeing some kind of a weaponization of the TLP by the Pakistani military ahead of the elections?
Gosh, I'm not sure if I know that one on Pakistan. I was just going to jump in on your point earlier, and Dr. Bruce's comment on the Taliban coming back, or Al-Qaeda coming back. My experience, and I was also in North Africa and I followed the Al-Qaeda groups there, especially in Mali, is they can be, as we saw with the Taliban, they can be reduced and defeated and really pushed out of areas, even, in complete surrender. And in Mali, they just had 3 commanders left out in the desert, and they managed to resurge and bring it back and restart groups to take over the whole country again. So Al-Qaeda might be lying quiet. They might seem to be down, and even in being controlled a bit by the Taliban doesn't mean to say they can't come back and recruit heavily in Afghanistan. So I'm very pessimistic about the future staying calm on that front. On the Taliban, one thing that the Pakistanis have I seen always do with the Taliban is try to control those groups, give them some leeway to act, but try and direct them. And so anyone who's followed it a lot knows the Pakistanis have always had this theory of the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. promote and support the good Taliban who are on their side, who pursue similar goals to the Pakistani government, and then try and either control or redirect the ones who they don't like. And so I think that's the way we can see things going forward. The Pakistanis are obviously now quite alarmed by the influx of weapons coming in from Afghanistan. They think that that's what's encouraged these recent attacks by the Baluch Liberation Army. It was quite surprising how big an attack it was. So there's some resurgence there, or some perhaps encouragement at the state of affairs. But they will try and control the groups that they feel could destabilize Pakistan. And so, they even used Al-Qaeda members in the past to try and control their own groups by using, someone like Osama bin Laden, who's a big enough sheikh to persuade other groups to go this way or that way. So there'll be a lot of that behind the scenes. It's very hard to read. You have to study very carefully who's saying what and going which way. But I think the Pakistanis are past masters of that. They'll have their hands full, but I think they'll be concentrated on that, directing the violence. They don't mind if there's lots of rebels or groups in Afghanistan. They won't mind that, but they won't want it directed or causing them problems at home.
So speaking of Pakistan, I want to turn to the region, since we're also cutting short on time. Ambassador Cunningham, could you maybe give us a letter, insight into what the regional countries are thinking, or what their continuing interests are in Afghanistan? Does those interests are those interests the same, or as they were prior to the collapse of the former government, prior to the Doha deal, or has those interests changed? Now, what has come out of the Taliban meetings over the past 2 or so months? They've traveled to Pakistan, they've traveled to Moscow, Tehran. They frequently go to Doha. Some of them have traveled to Turkmenistan, and most recently Norway as well.
Well, I think the shared interest all the countries of the region have is having some kind of stability in Afghanistan, which the international presence led by the United States provided for quite some time. And even when we were negotiating our bilateral security agreement and our longer term presence in Afghanistan, even the Iranians acknowledged that while they didn't like having an American presence next door, that it more or less served their interest in preventing instability and unpredictability in the country. That now, of course, that became clear with the Trump administration that was not going to last for very long. So for some time now, the regional countries have been recalculating their interests and how to protect them, how to maintain some degree of influence in Afghanistan's affairs, and how to create a context in which militant Islam and terrorism wouldn't be resurgent in the country. And that is a different equation for each country. But I think what they're seeing now, and I'm guessing, but I've heard this specifically about the Russians, is that the situation that they're going to be dealing with is going to be a lot more unpredictable than they might have thought, and that the Taliban are not going to prove particularly forthcoming in their behavior vis-a-vis Iran, Russia, China, or anybody else. They will take anything that any of those countries is willing to give them. They will provide some kind of lip service about combating ISIS and controlling Al-Qaeda, just as they did with us. But I don't see any sign that they're willing to mitigate or moderate their behavior dealing with the demands from the regional countries as they are from the rest of the international community. Now, maybe that will change going forward as they start to realize the very, very deep hole that Afghanistan and their government is in, which is, in my view, going to only become deeper. But right now, there's little sign of that. So we are still, I think, quite correctly, along with our international partners, trying to maintain a common united front as much as we can in terms of certain key conditions that we all expect the Taliban regime to meet, including developing a more a more inclusive form of governance than the Taliban seem determined to implement. But this is going to be a real problem for the regional countries going forward, because they are all going to have a difficulty, particularly if Al-Qaeda does become resurgent, which many of us predicted would be an outcome of the American departure. And if that happens, and if militants in the region do grow, which I also expect is going to happen, that will impinge on all the countries, including more distant ones like Russia and China, which is already terrified of Islamic influence among the Uyghurs. So this is going to be a very poisonous dynamic with very little ability to control it with any government that looks like the current Taliban regime.
Yeah, no, as you mentioned, Ambassador Cunningham, the buyer's remorse in the region is very real. If there's buyer's remorse, obviously there's a reason. So in some ways, the Taliban played all sides and very shrewdly. But you mentioned Iran and Russia, and I want to turn to Bruce and ask him a question about Iran and Russia's continuing or future role. We saw recently that Iranian president visited Moscow, met with Putin, and of course, he discussed Afghanistan among other things with him. So, in what way is the U.S. exit from Afghanistan an opportunity for Iran or from Russia, and in what ways does it present risk? We've seen countries in that region, Central Asian countries, including certain Central Asian countries, creating their own buffer zone on their borders with Afghanistan. Pakistan is doing exactly the same thing. So, in what ways do you see that these risks in getting expanded, and what do you think Iran or Russia will be doing about this?
Well, both countries, beyond any doubt, are thrilled by the United States withdrawal. I mean, if Putin is concerned about Ukraine joining NATO, I mean, having U.S. military forces and accompanying NATO allies as part of the ISAF in Afghanistan is something that they're very happy to be rid of. And it also increases their influence over the stands, especially potentially a country like Tajikistan, where the Taliban has massed forces on the border. I think in Iran's case, they're also glad to see both defeat meted out to, of course, their long-standing, most reviled enemy, the United States, and as a chance to perhaps, project their interests into Afghanistan. But more than that, I would say what worries the Taliban is Iran, and what worries the Taliban is that if ISIS-K continues down the road of their attacking of Hazara and Shia mosques, especially during services, that this could provoke some kind of Iranian intervention or even Iranian use of proxy forces in Afghanistan, much as they've been doing in Iraq. So that, I would say, is the big question in terms of Iranian interest in Afghanistan and Taliban concerns.
That's an excellent point, and it's not just them, but also other key regional countries who have lost a great deal of, unfortunately, influence, like India. Now, at least no country has formally recognized the new Taliban government as yet, even though there is engagement with that recognition. There have also been, as mentioned, high-level visits taking place between the Taliban and these countries on a fairly regular basis. Now, how long do you think that that will remain the case? And what might prompt key regional countries like India or China, for that matter, to change their stance? Now, the Pakistani Prime Minister is presently visiting China, where I think he's likely, at least this is how it's reported, that he will be seeking a new $3 billion loan from China. Prime Minister Imran Khan has also accused Western governments of double standards in their positions on Uyghurs in China and Muslims in Kashmir, for example. Now, how does these new realities, including the new reality in Afghanistan, affect India's own regional influence, its posture, its prestige?
Well, I'm frankly a bit surprised that countries like China, maybe even Russia, have not yet recognized the Taliban regime. And I think it's for the reasons that you spelled out, Javed, that they are feeling a bit of buyer's remorse, particularly Russia and Iran. Because as I said at the outset, the one surprising thing was to see the ascendancy of hardliners within the Taliban. And I think the Russians, were played by the Taliban and felt there was going to be an inclusive government and power sharing, and none of that happened. And I think that so that explains why they've held back from recognizing. I think they are fairly alarmed at seeing how the hardliners have come out on top. And so they're waiting to see how things play out. Certainly the Chinese, the Russians don't care about the human rights issue, something that the US and our European friends take very seriously. So I don't think they will hold back on recognizing the Taliban based on human rights concerns. However, they may want to see how the terrorism issues are playing out. The Chinese, of course, are worried about ETIM, these Turkmenistan Islamic movement, because of the Uyghur problem. So, they may see what happens on that front before they move forward. But this brings me to another point, which is it's really important. I said that, we should be engaging, but the kind of engagement must be conditional. And I think this is really important because, unfortunately, the way the U.S. negotiated the Doha Agreement, the U.S. Made far too many concessions to the Taliban. The Taliban ended up getting almost everything they wanted. So it was a very weak negotiating style, and we simply cannot repeat those same mistakes. It has to be conditional engagement. The Taliban knows they need international assistance, international aid. So, they need to meet the international community's conditions and come forward. So that's the first point. The second point is this Troika Plus arrangement where the U.S. Is in a grouping with Pakistan, China, and Russia. This really doesn't serve U.S. interests. Because again, China and Russia don't really care about the human rights situation. They're not going to be helpful on that front. And then Pakistan, as I explained earlier, does not have our same terrorism interests, counterterrorism interests. And so I don't see that grouping as really helping the U.S. in terms of asserting the kinds of policies and demands that we have. I think the U.S. would be better off working with like-minded nations, the Europeans, maybe India, other nations that actually care about human rights, what's happening to the Afghan people, and that also share our terrorism concerns. So again, the terms of the engagement are important. Unfortunately, I think the reason we see the ascendancy of the hardliners, we see the Taliban trying to dictate the terms of engagement is because of the terrible way that we handled the Doha negotiations. And the fact that the Taliban felt so emboldened to write an open letter to the US Congress demanding that the US unfreeze these assets shows you how bad the situation has gotten and how much of our leverage we sacrificed in those negotiations. So I think, we should be engaging, on a conditional basis, making demands, and not just conceding to the Taliban because they now hold the position of power.
I mean, you're right, Lisa, about Troika Plus. It's not the right kind of grouping, and I think there are more divergences or areas of divergences in that grouping than there are areas of convergences. And I think all those areas of convergences are unfortunately in this grouping tainted by some groups, own duplicity with other groups. So you're right. Now, Carlotta, where does Turkey stand in all of this? I mean, Turkey has a very strong relationship with Pakistan, and we've also seen recently Turkey's deepened relationship with the Taliban, but also they have a very strong relationship with the Qataris. We've seen reports about Turkey and Qatar now concluding an agreement with the Taliban to operate 5 of the Afghan airports. Now, is Turkey likely to limit its engagement to the airport, or is there more to this partnership?
I think this is where you have to realize, and I think the Taliban will gradually realize, that these regional countries can't help that much. The money won't come from Russia, for example, to run the country. And Turkey's a bit the same. I mean, Turkey really did want to help. They do have an affinity with Afghanistan, and especially, of course, a lot of the minorities in the north, they consider Turkish brothers. I mean, they're Turkic languages, and they're very similar, and they've long supported, of course, the Uzbek leader Dostum, General Dostum, who lives here in Turkey. So the Turks were offering, to secure the airport at the beginning. Then the Taliban didn't want any military or any NATO countries there, so that fell through. Then they said, okay, we'll run the airport. They still, 6 months later, haven't been able to negotiate that agreement. They say they're close, but actually, the Qatari flight that came in, Turkey and Qatar were offering to run it together. And it's quite complicated. There's a huge sum of money to pay for radar. But the main problem is who will secure the terminal. You can imagine what international flights can come in and out if you haven't got satisfactory security checking things. And they still can't agree. As far as I understand, they still can't agree that Turkey and Qatar want their own security personnel inside the terminal buildings, and that's still not agreed, and money, I think, still not agreed. So 6 months later, Turkey actually has found it really difficult to negotiate with the Taliban, and they are one of the few who have an embassy still functioning in Kabul, so they can speak to the Taliban every day, but it just shows how difficult it is. And I think for the Taliban, Turkey is not a big player in that. It can help. It is helping with some humanitarian funds, but it's not going to help them, unfreeze all the money. And let's face it, it's really only America and Europe that can fund on the scale that they were doing and that Afghanistan needs, which is, 75% of its budget was coming from international donors, and that's really the West. It's not going to come from China or Russia or Iran or Pakistan. So Turkey's a bit in that league. They are with NATO, obviously, would like to facilitate. They would love to get contracts to rebuild anything, but they're not going to be able to really swing a deal with the Taliban that's going to change things in the big level.
And then the airports is not just a revenue generating mechanism for any Afghan government. It used to be for the Republic as well, but it is definitely for the Taliban, a key source of income, a key source of revenues, but it's also a key source of intelligence. I mean, anybody, who travels outside or out of Kabul airport, whoever comes in, it's a source of intelligence. So the former Afghan Republic had in the last year engaged the UAE on this one. So the UAE came in as part of 3 companies, that state-run companies that formed the consortium, and they took care of the aviation security, the ground handling services, but they were also managing the terminal operations. And I think the agreement that the 2 governments had was through a revenue sharing. So a portion of the revenues that they were raising through the aviation or terminal operations and airlines, it would go to those companies. So it could be offset, but the Taliban could potentially come up with something else as well, maybe another creative way, an X for Y kind of a situation where certain companies pay for certain things, and then in return they get maybe a concession agreement on mining, for example. But I want to ask all of you to comment on. We're cutting short on time, to maybe comment on where do we see things going forward now. What should we be paying particularly attention to over the next few months? Are we likely to see the Taliban agreeing to some kind of a roadmap to form a broad-based, inclusive government that's led by the Taliban themselves? If so, structurally and ideologically, how might the skeleton of that government look like? Whoever wants to start, Ambassador Cunningham.
Sure. The Taliban set out their vision for quote unquote inclusive government some years ago when I was still ambassador to Afghanistan. They published a piece, a message of some sort, which said, yeah, we will have an inclusive government when we return to power. It will be under our structure, the emirate structure, but we will bring in technocrats. We'll include technocrats in the government to help run the government. And that's, as far as I can tell, that's still their vision. What they would like to do is reestablish the dictatorial authoritarian structure of the emirate, and then bring in people where they need experts to run the various things. And I think what Carlotta's explanation of what's happening at the airport is a very clear example of the difficulties going forward. Because if there's one thing that they should have been able to organize themselves to do, it's to come to an agreement with two countries that want to run the airport and who don't really pose ideological or other problems. And they've been unable to do even that because of their own fecklessness and internal inability to make decisions. So that's not a very good sign for things going forward. And I have to say, I'm rather pessimistic for the future, unless there's some epiphany that goes on among the Taliban leadership at some point. And that's why I respectfully disagree with you and Lisa about the Troika and other floating mechanisms. None of these mechanisms are very good or efficient, but the only way to try to maintain some degree of international cohesion and basic principles that the Taliban have to meet going forward is to try to engage everybody that has a stake now in the future of Afghanistan, and that includes Russia and China, and very importantly, as Lisa explained before, Pakistan. So I don't expect anything great to come out of participation in Troika Plus meetings, but I think it's still good to maintain those channels of communication. And right now, at least formally, we're still on the same page on certain basic principles. I said I'm pessimistic that this is going to have the effect that we would like to see in the foreseeable future, but I think we owe it to ourselves and to Afghanistan to try.
Bruce, do you share Ambassador Cunningham's pessimism on the way forward?
Well, if you're a terrorism specialist and you've been following the events of the past 6 or so months, it's impossible not to be a pessimist. One can only wonder how much worse it can become. And in that respect, let me draw a parallel to yesterday's tremendous success achieved by the United States in eliminating the leader of ISIS, and some of the themes that have been channeled that I think are applicable to Afghanistan. I mean, on the one hand, you have people rightly trumpeting the success of U.S. Special Operations Forces, and then extending that to say, see, the over-the-horizon approach works. But let's disaggregate the factors. I mean, there's still 900 U.S. troops on the ground in Syria. Secondly, as the Biden administration said, the success of yesterday's raid was dependent upon intelligence provided by indigenous allies in the Syrian defense forces. And even if the Delta Force commandos hadn't used one of the existing US bases in northern Syria to mount that attack, there are any number of surrounding countries, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, that they could have used. Let's transpose that to South Asia and to Afghanistan. None of those elements are present. So I think the application of the over-the-horizon capability has yet to be realized there. And the one example in South Asia, of course, resulted in unmitigated tragedy. That was just before the US withdrawal, that drone strike that killed an entire family. And if yesterday's raid was so successful, it was also because of the on-the-ground intelligence that could be gathered. That, as we heard General McKenzie say in his keynote address at the MEI conference yesterday, I mean, those types of intelligence assets are not as prevalent in South Asia. So whatever challenges we face in counterterrorism are going to be protracted and long-standing. Whether they worsen or not, I can't say. But like Ambassador Cunningham, it's very difficult at this juncture of time to have any kind of optimism.
Yeah. Carlotta, if there's no agreement on a political roadmap between the Taliban and non-Taliban Afghans, what does the future hold? Are we looking at alternative power structures emerging from either within or outside the Taliban that could potentially challenge the new rulers?
I think we will see that. It's winter now, so they've all been hiding or taking refuge outside the country. But I think we will see a return. There is the National Front movement of Ahmad Massoud. I think they're gearing up to do stuff, and some of them are already doing things. They're already announcing things. There are little attacks on Taliban. Taliban are killed every so often in Kabul. There are sticky bombs places. And then we just saw Dostum's son, Yar Mohammed, turn up claiming to be in northern Afghanistan. He's obviously going to try and work on this dispute that happened with the Uzbeks in the north. So I think you'll see that starting. As I mentioned, there's people from the Afghan security forces, the previous Republic forces, who I know have gone off to join ISIS just for protection. But if that continues, that could swell. So I think, and then you've got, internal disputes that I mentioned. You could see, really a falling out between groups if they don't get what they need. So I think you could see that accelerating in Afghanistan. And I think with the warmer weather, we'll see if that really is going to happen or not. And then for the moment, I don't think other countries are really supporting these groups. But of course, if it grows, then they will. So I think you could see, and then there are a lot of Afghans who tell me, and admittedly a lot of them are Afghans who left the country after last summer, who tell me people won't put up with the Taliban for long. So, we're always having this discussion, are they going to survive months or years? There's a lot of Afghans who feel they won't be able to hold on because just the nation has moved on and they won't put up with being forced back to live under the thumb of a police state. We'll have to see on that. But there's a lot of Afghans who predict there's trouble down the road for the Taliban.
Yeah, let me push back on that one, Carlotta, because there's also one question from our audience in this regard directed at you. It says that there are reports that some former anti-Taliban figures are gathering in Tajikistan and elsewhere, and they're trying to regroup and launch a resistance beginning in the next spring. So how big of a deal do you think this is, or would this change the equation? Are they going to likely do anything which might draw some kind of Western or international attention to them, or can they challenge the Taliban's current rule or not? In this respect, let me also sort of combine this. My own question is there an appetite or an interest in a place like Washington or other Western capitals to support such an opposition?
So my understanding on the last question is there's zero interest, certainly in Washington and elsewhere, to help these. I mean, apart from Tajikistan, which is hosting some of the people who fled, including, as far as I understand, the vice president, Amrullah Saleh, and Ahmad Massoud, who's the leader of a Panjshiri movement. Well, more than the Panjshiri movement, but he's one of the youth leaders of the minorities from the north. So I think for the moment, they're not doing anything. I mean, they say they have some people on the ground, that there is a few skirmishes, but really there's nothing going on at the moment. And I think they have zero support from the outside. But what I do think is that it's winter and they're just regrouping and trying to get organized. And then I think that with the spring weather, when the snow clears in the mountains, then I think we'll see. But we are already seeing some attacks on Taliban. I mean, Taliban are getting assassinated now. I don't know if that's criminal or if that's some sort of organized opposition, but it is happening. And you're having, a few bomb attacks. So that's how it would start, I imagine. And that's obviously very easy to do a low-level, essentially an insurgency, but it's really just low-level attacks. Whether that can actually upset the Taliban in a big way, not necessarily, we'd have to see. But what it can do is it can cause the Taliban to make reprisals, or as we see, suppress dissent in a very violent way, and that will make the public very unhappy. I mean, already people are outraged by the women who've been detained. So that's where the Taliban can have a problem if they, and then, they arrested the Taliban Uzbek leader in the north recently, and that's upset all the Uzbeks. And you upset the Uzbeks in Faryab, and you've got real, that can spill into several provinces. So I think it's very early days to know, and they have great difficulty with, not perhaps with weapons, but with supplies, with hospitals. How you run an insurgency when the Taliban controls all the borders? So there could be a lot of difficulty in doing much, but I think there will be resistance in the population. Yes.
Lisa, where do you see things going forward? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, I'm afraid I agree with Bruce on the likelihood of terrorism problems getting worse, of Al-Qaeda reemerging, and the Taliban, not doing anything to sort of stifle their activity. I mean, let's face it, their raison d'etre is to attack the West. So, trying to hold them back from, exporting terrorism and doing what they ideologically are committed to doing is likely not to happen. So I'm very pessimistic on the terrorism front. I'm also pessimistic that the Taliban is going to share power or, have an inclusive government. I don't see that happening. And I think I largely agree with Carlotta that the National Resistance Force and the opposition forces are largely down and out right now. I think they are trying to regroup, and they have a sort of base in Tajikistan. And so it is possible that over time, they can rebuild themselves. But frankly, they're going to have to try to unify their ranks. This was, one of the contributors to the Taliban being able to take power so quickly, is the anti-Taliban forces were so disparate and ununified. So I think that there's some need for the expatriate Afghans to come together politically, that if they really want to pose a challenge to the Taliban, or at least advocate for the Afghan people and their rights inside Afghanistan, they have to find a way to come together and overcome their own political differences. My biggest concern, though, is that the Biden administration is going to want to just close the book. I think you see President Biden already wanting to just wash his hands of Afghanistan, move on. And that would be a major mistake for many reasons, morally, strategically. The fact that we invested so much blood and treasure there for the last 20 years, I believe the United States must remain engaged. We have to do what we can to support the human rights of the Afghans that remain there. We should be working closely with the diaspora of Afghanistan. There, are many Afghans kind of now, spread out in the United States, Europe, and other countries, Turkey. But we should be closely engaged with them, both to monitor the situation inside Afghanistan to get the real story of what's happening. We know the Taliban are stifling media, arresting journalists. So we need to rely on sort of the Afghan diaspora to get information on the situation, but then also to support efforts. If they are starting to come together and pose opposition to the Taliban, we want to be working with them. I mean, these are people that have our same human rights and counterterrorism interests. And so I'm not saying we want to be arming groups or anything of that nature, but we certainly should remain engaged with them at the political level, the diplomatic level. We should be meeting with these people and just talking about the situation and what can be done to further the interests of average Afghans.
And then the diaspora too, Lisa, to your point, also needs a common winning message and maybe some kind of a Dalai Lama-like figure that could, rally everyone around himself and, in this winning message. But Bruce, on the terrorism front, so what are the continuing U.S. rules of engagement? Has the United States operationally defined what an over-the-horizon engagement will look like?
Well, I mean, in broad terms, yes. It's projection of whether it's deployment of special operations commando-like forces or the use of aviation platforms. Certainly, in recent weeks, Secretary Austin has imposed new scrutiny on these operations so that they won't repeat the tragedy that occurred shortly before the U.S. withdrawal in Kabul. But all these types of over-the-horizon capabilities are dependent on intelligence, and that's going to be the proof in the pudding. How we can address any emerging or identified threats in Afghanistan, whether it's coming from Al Qaeda or one of the Central Asian franchises, or indeed ISIS-K, and how effective we'll be at dealing with them. As I said, my suspicion is that a lot of the elements, maybe even all the elements that made yesterday's raid in northern Syria so successful, really aren't present or operable in Afghanistan.
If I could just add to that, one of the fundamental reasons that I and many others argued against withdrawing from Afghanistan is precisely because we lose all of our intelligence in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan and to some degree in Pakistan as well, and other parts of the region. And that's blind now, that's completely gone. And Professor Huffman is quite right in identifying the two things that you need for over-the-horizon capability. You need proximity and intelligence, and we have neither in Afghanistan. And there's no real possibility of any meaningful over-the-horizon anti-terrorism capability in Afghanistan unless some terrorist group wants to sit themselves on top of a mountain and broadcast that they're there so we can find them.
Also, Ambassador Cunningham, there's a relevant question from one of our audiences. Perhaps it'd be good if you could take this. The question is, what effect has the American withdrawal from Afghanistan had on India's policy of cooperating with the United States via the Quad mechanism? So to what extent has both the process and the substance of the American exit undercut India's partnership with the United States?
I don't think it's undercut India's partnership with the United States. The Indians have been skeptical for a long time that the United States had the patience to maintain the kind of long-term policy that was called for in Afghanistan. I'm sure they're not very pleased with the outcome, and certainly the withdrawal decision and the way it was implemented have undercut the kind of picture of competence that one would like to see on the part of the United States, if I could put it mildly. But we in India have very similar interests in Afghanistan as we do in other parts of Asia and in the region. And I think that that commonality of interest will continue to bind us much more closely than the differences we might have about how we got out of Afghanistan.
Great.
Can I just chime in real quick,
Please.
Javed? Yeah, so the Indians were really disappointed that human rights was not given more attention in the December UN Security Council resolution. So again, I think that, you know, we have similar interests to India when it comes to Afghanistan, and we should be working closely with them rather than, you know, trying to, you know, work with the Russians, Chinese. I know Ambassador Cunningham, you know, made a good point. We still should try to find common ground, but at the same time, we need to be clear on who is it that shares our same interests, and, you know, when we need to get something done, then we need to work with our partners. And you know, France also was not happy about the lack of attention to human rights in the last UN Security Council resolution. Why aren't we working with, you know, France, London? You know, I think we need to recognize who our partners are that share our interests, and then work with them to be able to make our case. For some reason, I think that we have, when it comes to diplomacy, we end up not working with those who share our same interests, and try too much to placate those that have differing interests. And I think this Security Council resolution is one example of that.
Lisa, there's also another question that's related to this, posed to you by one of our audiences, asking you how you see and I know we're very short on time, we have about 3 minutes, and how you see the Pakistan-Taliban relationship in light of the recent border incidents, as well as the TTP accelerated activities in Pakistan against the security forces. I know that you already answered this question, but so let me combine this with my question as to the future state of U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I mean, we often discuss options, but not choices. So what are our choices here now? Not options, but choices. And what are our options with respect to dealing with Pakistan going forward?
Well, I think that Pakistan will try to, you know, manipulate the Taliban to get its own interests met in terms of the TTP. They'll try to, you know, use leaders to facilitate agreements. But again, I think that, you know, they've chosen, they have put their eggs in the Haqqani's basket, and they have supported the hardliners. So it shouldn't be surprising when we see hardline extremist groups like TTP emboldened and increasing their attacks in Pakistan. With regard to U.S. options on Pakistan, look, I think at this point we can largely ignore Pakistan. They're not going to help in terms of our interests in Afghanistan. The only thing we rely on is the Pakistani airspace. So I think we should do the minimal that needs to be done in order to retain access to Pakistani airspace. But I'm not a believer in, let's increase our assistance to Pakistan and try to get them to help us on the counterterrorism front. We've been down that road before. It did not work. I think we just have to accept that Pakistan pursues its own interests, and that we can't really impact that calculation very much. And so we just keep our expectations of Pakistan very low.
Thank you. We ran out of time, unfortunately. I wish we had a little bit more time, but this was a terrific panel. And let me conclude by saying that Afghanistan collapse on the 15th of August was a spectacular defeat in all forms, as we discussed today. But I think it's also fair to say that the collapse was, perhaps only one part of those multiple defeats. And from what we're seeing now and what we discussed today, is that what is unfolding in Afghanistan in the broader region. I feel like there are many more manifestations of that August 15 defeat that we're yet to see, especially if the Taliban do not openly commit themselves to some kind of a compromise. So I think considering everything we've learned or unlearned from the Afghan experiences, I think it's difficult to determine whether the United States' current restrained approach, one I would characterize as, less is more approach, is the right path to meaningfully engage with a new Taliban regime, or whether we are staying at another defeat. It has to be seen in the months ahead. But needless to say, I think outsourcing or subcontracting the Afghan problem in doing too little because of fears that doing too much could potentially spill the risk of another defeat or some kind of a U.S. mission creep is not really a solution. But for now, we'll leave it at that. And let me thank you again, all of our 4 speakers and our viewers for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks to all. Take care.